Dawn over a cold plain. Frost breathes off the grass like smoke from a sleeping dragon. Somewhere out in the haze, steel clinks against steel, and a low mechanical heartbeat gathers, steady and sure. Men lift binoculars. Someone whispers, "Panzers?" A young officer shakes his head. "Amerikaner." He says it with a shrug that tries to hide nerves. For months, German soldiers have traded a single opinion through trenches and command posts, from the dunes of Libya to the hedgerows of Normandy. American tanks are clumsy, soft-shelled, full of gasoline and bravado. They break, they burn, they retreat when it gets hard. An armored force for a nation that knows how to make cars, not war. It is a simple idea. And in war, simple ideas are seductive. They don't need evidence, just repetition. The first American tanks many Germans encountered, the tall, odd-looking M3 South with a whole gun and a small turret, were like caricatures of awkward strength. In desert ambushes, German anti-tank guns punched through them with brutal certainty. Even when the M4 Sherman appeared neat and rounded with a quick-turning turret and a 75mm gun, the notion lingered. A decent tank, perhaps, but no match for a long-barreled Panzer IV, and certainly not for the sleek new cats, Panther and Tiger, that prowled in the German imagination like armored myths come alive. But that is not the picture in the frost this morning. Through the mist, the American machines come in columns that keep coming. Shermans in files of 3 and 4, steel elbows brushing, antennae flicking, their guns not hunting for duels but covering arcs, calling to infantry, to artillery, to the sky. When a German gun opens from a hedgerow, an entire grid square answers. Smoke, high explosive, machine guns, mortar, all talking at once, a language of steel that says not beauty in single combat, but certainty in combined effort. If the German army had learned any hard lesson by 1944, it was this: numbers were not just more of the same. Numbers changed the character of battle. They turned isolated fears into patterns, helping the other side learn faster than you could hurt them. Numbers meant that one knocked-out tank did not stop the attack. Numbers meant that logistics mattered as much as bravery, that mechanics mattered as much as aces, that radios mattered as much as optics. In the fog, the Shermans do not arrive to prove they are immortal. They arrive to prove they are many, reliable, and part of a bigger machine than a single tank. The legend of the Sherman would be written not in the emphatic punctuation of single duels, but in the long grammar of campaigns. German troops who learned to respect the Sherman did not do so because it was perfect. They did so because it kept showing up. After a firefight, after a breakdown, after a forced march, after a bridge was blown and another built overnight, it was there again. It was there in North Africa. It was there in Sicily and Italy's mountains. It was there in Normandy's hedgerows. It was skylined in the Ardennes snow and oily with Rhine River mist. And always, behind it, a river of parts, fuel, and replacements that did not thin out when the weather turned or when luck went bitter. War is made of men and myths. The German myths were elegant. The invincible tiger, the perfect shot at 2,000 meters, the ace who could prowl and destroy. The American myth that replaced them was less dramatic and more frightening. An army that could learn from a bad day and return in force tomorrow. The Sherman was the face of that myth, the everyday hero of an industrial democracy that built not just a tank, but a fleet, not just a fleet, but a system. Before this war ended, German soldiers would scribble in diaries about American tanks swarming like bees, appearing where bridges had been wrecked, where roads were mud, where gasoline was believed to have run out. They would complain about how difficult it was to flank them when a second echelon always waited, how a knocked-out tank at noon became a running one by dusk, how artillery found them because tanks called it down by radio fast. They would grumble that the Americans did not play fair, that they refused to meet a panzer in the single-shot duel a panther was bred for. In the end, weak becomes a fragile word. The Sherman's armor was not thick as a tiger's, its gun not as powerful as a panther's at long range. On a test range or a duel-friendly stage, those facts mattered. On the moving canvases of Tunis, Normandy, and the Ardennes, what mattered more was how a tool fit into a team. This is the story of how German troops learned that lesson the hard way. Not in a single revelation, but in a series of scenes where a tank modest in silhouette, generous in spares, and relentless in presence changed the certainty of every battlefield it touched. Listen to engines. Watch fog thin. The columns do not hesitate. The Shermans advance not as lone heroes, but as the visible tips of an unseen spear dispatchers, drivers, fuel crews, signalmen, mechanics, replacement pilots, supply sergeants, map printers, bridge builders. That is the sound the Germans hear this morning. Not just tanks rolling, a system rolling. And once you've met that, you stop asking if a single tank is weak and start wondering if anything you have can stop what's behind it. Years earlier, under a North African sun that polished horizon lines to a hard white edge, the first American armored columns stumbled into Rommel's school. At Kasserine Pass, untested crews and green commanders drove into ambush lanes and took the lesson every army must take first. Confidence is not competence, and machines do not forgive inexperience. German gunners with long-barreled 50s and 75s set up in gullies and on hardpan ridges, their rounds cracking through thin plates, smoke pouring into turret rings, rivets pinging in the terrible hail inside. The lanky M3 Lee, with its ungainly profile and split armament, made a large target. Even the new M4 Sherman's front armor, gently sloped, turret low and rounded, could be picked apart when used piecemeal and without a net of artillery and infantry. The German conclusion took root. American tanks were brave but brittle, their crews mechanically adept but tactically naive. The German army had spent years hardening itself in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Americans were still telling themselves tank stories from comic strips. Yet beneath the humiliation at Kasserine, American officers and NCOs went to work. They reorganized, practiced, rewrote, and drilled. They put radios in every tank and taught their crews to use them for more than chatter. They learned to call artillery by map and by voice, to synchronize with infantry, to trade speed for timing. The M4 fast, reliable, able to traverse its turret quickly, even when the terrain bucked, was a student that benefited from a teacher's attention. By El-Getter, the change was visible. Not in glorious duels, but in discipline. Shermans advanced behind smoke curtains laid by their own 75mm guns and supporting artillery. When German anti-tank crews opened up, American tankers slewed turrets and returned high-explosive shells and machine gun nests and infantry positions first, suppressing the eyes and hands that made German guns dangerous. In U.S. doctrine, tanks weren't solitary hunters of tanks. They were combined arms tools. They broke wire, broke morale, broke positions. If German armor came, tank destroyers would answer, or the tanks would fight as needed. But the default was clear. An American tank's shell was more often high explosive than armor piercing, and its most common targets had faces, not armor. German veterans felt the difference. The opponents who had been hesitant now moved with choreography. Assault guns that had once enjoyed ambuscades found themselves receiving unending he-storms. German tanks that drank precious fuel from thin supply lines watched American columns arrive with full jerrycans and a spare set of tracks on the turret sides. A German gun that knocked out a Sherman at noon discovered its crews pulling another into the slot by late afternoon, and a new line of sight under smoke by evening. One surprising detail stuck with German observers. American tanks seemed to shoot on the move. The Sherman's gyro stabilizer, a device more complex than most crews loved, occasionally ignored, but sometimes embraced allowed moments of aimed fire, while the hull was not perfectly still. It wasn't magic. It couldn't fix a wildly bouncing chassis, but it shaved seconds off engagements and discouraged the romantic pause and duel that long-barreled German tanks preferred. More importantly, Shermans kept talking over the radio while they moved. Orders and warnings moved with them, making a battlefield that changed shape faster than German commanders were used to. The Sherman benefited from the American industrial alphabet. Built by multiple plants, Chrysler, Ford, Pressed Steel Car, and others, it was standardized ruthlessly. You could swap a road wheel off one and fit it to another. You could train a mechanic in Alabama and have him useful in Tunisia. When a Sherman was hit, recovery vehicles makeshift at first, purpose-built M31 and M32 conversions later went forward under fire, hooked chains, and dragged the wounded back to the aid station of the armored world. Evacuation rate is a cold term, but wars are won by cold turns as much as by hot blood. The Americans recovered and repaired their tanks at a rate that left German units, starved of spares and beset by raids, envious. Italian mountains imposed new lessons. In Sicily and on the Boot, Sherman columns proved that reliability had its own kind of courage. They climbed narrow roads where a broken transmission would jam an entire division, and they did not break often. In towns with stone houses and sudden courtyards, they used their 75mm guns like sledgehammers against walls and machine gun nests. German troops, veteran at crafting kill zones, learned to fear the sudden appearance of a Sherman's blunt snout at the end of a side street, infantry swarming its flanks, a tank's coaxial machine gun stitching doorways, while its commander talked a mortar barrage onto a suspected gun pit. To a German tanker, the M4 still looked unimpressive on paper. Armor thickness mid-range. Gun adequate but not awe-inspiring. Gasoline engine a supposed liability in fire risk. But experience began to creep into judgment. The Ronson myth that Shermans always ignited on the first hit quickly rubbed against inconvenient reality. Many Allied tanks burned because ammunition cooked off when penetrated. True. So did German tanks under the same conditions. And as American designers shifted to wet, ammunition stowage jacketed with water and glycol to cool propellant, the likelihood of post-penetration fires fell dramatically. Crews noticed. So did their enemies, who had counted on flames to turn a knockout into a funeral. Meanwhile, American artillery revealed itself as the Sherman's older, louder brother. A radio call could bring a time-on-target barrage that made a hilltop untenable. German infantry, who had once waited for the tank duel to decide their fate, discovered that the duel no longer mattered if they could not raise their heads to see it. Aircraft worried command posts and columns. P-40s and P-47s, more feared in German memory than they were statistically deadly to tanks, nevertheless tightened a ring of nerves around daylight movement. The American army didn't fight with stars. It fought with constellations. The Sherman was one bright light in a cluster that moved together. By the time Allied armies reached Naples and pushed North German troops knew a new fact. You could win a brilliant defensive battle against an American armored spearhead in the morning, and by evening, the spear returned with different angles, more smoke, fresh barrels, and the same infuriating insistence on not quitting. In that repetition, weak had already begun to die. A weak thing fails alone. The Sherman rarely fought alone anymore. Then came Normandy, where hedgerows turned fields into fortresses. The bocage looked like a pastoral postcard until you stood against it. Earthbanks 3 to 5 feet high, woven with roots and topped by dense hedges, made each field a walled courtyard with slender gateways that were death funnels. German infantry parked anti-tank guns behind openings a man could block with one toppled tree. Panthers and dug-in stooges waited at angles that maximized the first shot. American tankers who had crossed the channel with nerves and bravado met a geometry that mocked both. A Sherman's best angle of attack speed, flanking movement, fire, and maneuver collapsed when every move ended in a bank. To nose up and over was to offer your belly-thin armor and fuel lines to a waiting shell. When American tankers tried, they paid hard. German gunners, their optics excellent, their discipline drilled across years, put the first rounds into the first tank at the first opening. The second and third might follow, caught nose-up silhouettes against the sky. The impression, again, was easy. The Sherman, put in a cage, died like a bull in a ring. But armies do not live with impressions. They adapt or they die. In the Norman hedgerows, the Sherman showed how adaptation loves a mass army. A sergeant from an armored division welded blades culled from Tunisian beach obstacles to his tank's front and cut through a hedgerow instead of trying to climb it. Others saw. Officers asked, crews welded. Within days, Rhino tanks shoved through banks in unexpected places, spewing surprise. Infantry kept close, often walking with their fingers touching the tank's sponsons to avoid sniper fire, and to ensure that when a Panzerfaust streaked from a hedgerow, someone could see and shout. Tank commanders stood high in their turrets with new split-hatch cupolas, 360-degree vision, improving their odds against the next shot. German units adjusted too. They had weapons for this terrain. The Panzerfaust, cheap, light, abundant, turned any hedgerow corner into a potential ambush. The Panther, lethal at range in the open, was less comfortable in a maze, but its front armor shrugged off many Sherman shells, and its gun rolled across fields when it found a lane. Dug-in guns with long 75s Pak-40s were the true killers, their crews decades older and cooler than the young men crawling around with Fausts and fears. American doctrine bent without breaking. They shifted to combined breaches. Engineers with Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps. Artillery poured smoke right on the nose of suspected positions. Shermans used their 75s as literal hedgerow cutters, blasting holes before pushing through. When Panthers appeared, most Shermans did not duel them face-on. They called for help. This help took forms the Germans had learned to dread. A British Firefly Sherman hull made it to a long, dangerous 17-pounder gun sidled in and made long-range nonsense of German armor advantages. An M10 or M36 tank destroyer unbuttoned the culvert with a 3-inch or 90mm shot. Failing that, artillery erased the problem, or fighter bombers at least made German crews think twice about staying put. There were American Shermans with longer 76mm guns on the far shore of the Channel by the time of the landings, but not enough had been issued to units in the first waves. The 75mm remained the common mouth of the Sherman through June and July. Tankers griped when their AP rounds bounced against frontal plates. They also quietly celebrated what their 75 did better. Its high explosive shell did vicious work against the real majority of targets' guns, houses, machine gun nests. In grim tallies, most targets a tank engaged were not enemy tanks. Outnumbered by German heavy armor in individual duels, the Sherman was utterly dominant in the ugly algebra of supporting an infantry advance. Normandy punished everyone. German troops learned the toll of Allied artillery, steel that arrived with the map's consent and left no corner safe. American troops learned the value of keeping at least one more platoon alive than the enemy expected. Out of that pressure came Operation Cobra, a lesson in mass that terrifies logistics officers and enemy commanders equally. Aerial bombardment plowed a hole. Shermans poured through, dust clouds marking the hourglass curves of breakout routes. Columns passing through columns past German units that could not believe, simply could not believe, that a breach that wide could be sustained with fuel, oil, food, and ammunition. And yet, it was. After Cobra, American armor accelerated into open country, and at last the Panther stood where it preferred to fight fields and flatland, long lines of fire. German units had their chance. Some took it. There were brutal days when Panther guns knocked out Shermans like a grim clock. two at 800 meters, one at 1,000, another flanking tank that never got his shot. But those days were islands in a sea of motion. The Shermans didn't stop coming. Smoke blossomed, hiding rangefinder marks. Artillery walked up the lines. Flanking columns edged at kilometers, not meters. A German battalion commander, who saved his Panthers from a rash charge, found himself ordered to counterattack anyway to plug a gap. And in the gap where American tanks moved with infantry and self-propelled guns and recon and radios, buzzing the Panthers, died to air, bursts, bazookas, and simple numbers that smothered tactical elegance. Mortain compressed it all. German divisions lunged west to cut the American breakout. To throw armor at a spear meant to stab at its branches. American tankers and destroyer crews rolled to the sound of the guns and dug in on hills with good arcs. Shermans that had spent June peering through hedges now sat hull down, using the curves of Normandy against those who had never wanted to defend here. German tanks came with bravery and thin fuel. They were greeted by the modern U.S. answer. Everyone shooting, everyone calling, everyone tied by wire and radio and map. Fighter bombers were summoned by flares and smoke panels, and by belief itself, the belief that the system would answer. It did. Even when their rockets missed tanks and cratered fields, their presence pinned heads, broke concentrations, delayed timing. The counterattack failed. The Falaise pocket closed, and German columns tried to flee under an iron rain. The Sherman's treads ground past a tableau of wrecked half-tracks and abandoned Tigers, testament less to individual tank fights than to collapse. In collapse, numbers do their most terrible work. By August, German troops did not talk about the Sherman as a weak tank. They talked about the Americans as an inexhaustible machine that turned fields into corridors of metal and towns into trapdoors. The Sherman's silhouette, once underestimated, had become a sign not of inferiority, but of an enemy that refused to be drawn into the duel a lordly panther desired. By the time Allied armies reached the Seine, the verdict was not yet victory. It was momentum. The war turned white and blue. White of Ardennes snow, blue of cold that cracked oil and stalled engines. German commanders planned a winter surprise. A thrust through the thick woods and old roads where the weather might ground Allied aircraft and give armor the cover it needed. They found gaps, hit them hard, and at first the American defense folded like a map crease. Town names St. Vith, Clairvaux, Normandy became cold notes in the ledger of shock. In those first days, German march tables beat Allied timetables. Panthers prowled the snow, whitewashed, and Tigers rolled where bridges could carry them. German soldiers imagined, perhaps for the last time, that American tanks would prove the rumor again and yield. What they found were men and machines crusted with ice who had been taught, by pain, how to slow a blow until the big machine could pivot. Tankers parked Shermans behind stone walls, behind haystacks, behind the shoulders of hills. When German columns hit a village, an American tank platoon that couldn't win instantly nevertheless could make the German victory take hours. In those hours, division headquarters pulled maps, engineers wired bridges for demolition, artillery units chose their prep-planned fires, reconnaissance cars sniffed for flanking roads, and far behind, trains shifted loads so that gasoline would be where the front went tomorrow, not where it had been yesterday. The Shermans that took those first punches were not all the same Shermans that had landed in France 6 months earlier. Newer models came into Europe with thicker armor and a longer 76mm gun, better suited for punching back at German armor across a field of snow. Crews called the improved suspension Easy 8 and cursed or loved it according to the day's mud. A few jumbo Shermans, overweight with extra armor, earned reputations as door openers, soaking punishment when others could not. The most dangerous rounds for the 76 high-velocity armor-piercing were scarce but decisive when on hand. And throughout, ammunition stowage had been rethought. Wet racks and better internal layout meant that a hit was less likely to turn into a cremation. Crews went into battle with the knowledge that if they were unlucky, they still had a good chance to climb out. German tankers who once bemoaned American electricity in summer hated it in winter. The Sherman's turret traverse remained fast, regardless of engine RPM. A Panther's turret, quick at high revs, slowed to a painful arc when the driver had to creep or idle. In tight village fights, when a Panzerfaust could emerge from any doorway, a few seconds meant the difference between a spray of machine gun fire and a crew bailing out into snow. American tanks used their speed of traverse and communications to fight like a hard flock of birds, wheeling together, suppressing together, always pulling back behind the next fold with smoke when the exchange turned bad. Everywhere in the Bulge were reminders that tanks are never alone. The most celebrated armor action of the winter relief of Bastogne came with tanks in snow, yes, but also with armored engineers, repairing roads under shell fire with traffic control that turned chaos into columns, with artillery offices that conjured barrages in the dark. When the spear reached Bastogne, the lead tank was a jumbo Sherman, whose thick plate soaked shots that would have torn through a lighter hull. It idled outside the town like a sleigh pulled by gasoline and courage, proof that a sturdy tool in the right place, at the right time, could be a hinge on which a campaign turned. German fuel, the secret story of their winter, hope ran thin. Abandonment became an enemy. Panthers were found abandoned, perfect machines in the wrong place with empty tanks. The Shermans that faced them burned gasoline by the river of the Red Ball Express, trucks shoving drums and jerrycans from ports to depots to forward dumps that moved with the front. Drivers, often black soldiers whose labor went unlauded after the war, wrestled tonnage over ice and ruined roads. A Sherman's appetite is a logistical sentence. The Americans finished it with a period. The German sentence trailed off with an ellipsis and a silence. When the winter broke, the steel rivers flowed toward the Rhine. A German army beaten in the west fought skillfully as it retreated, but retreat is a different art. Bridges fell. Ferries were overrun. Towns that might have been defended became waypoints. On one fog-shredded morning at Remagen, American infantry and armored reconnaissance looked up and saw a black lattice against the sky. The Ludendorff Bridge. The Germans had tried to bring it down and failed. In an instant, tactics ran ahead of strategy. Shermans were ordered forward, over a bridge that might fail under them. They crossed, one after another, broad-shouldered as always, antennas nodding, guns silent, tracks clanking. The Rhine, the ribbon that had defined Germany, was no longer a border. It was a ribbon under American tracks. German soldiers fought hard on the far bank, and at Remagen they tried desperately to erase the mistake. Artillery found the bridge. Divers went into the water. A V-2 rocket fell in the area, terrible and imprecise. For days, American engineers worked with the fearless stubbornness for which they would never receive parades, keeping the bridge whole long enough for tanks to get across. Even when it finally collapsed, the temporary bridges downstream and upstream made the Sherman's crossing a fact, not a miracle. The lesson, again, numbers do not make everything easy, but they make many things inevitable. The last months were a hard unraveling. German panzer brigades that in 1943 had prowled like knife fights now looked like improvisations. Tanks without companions they needed. No infantry to screen them, no guns to anchor them, no fuel to let them exploit their rare successes. American armored divisions were not perfect in their use of the Sherman. They lost men to overconfidence, to sudden traps, to a habit of believing a town was safe because they had been safe in a similar town yesterday. But even mistakes were tended by a system that refused to accept bleeding without learning. An after-action report written in March altered a drill in April. A change in ammunition mixes, a switch in how a column stacked vehicles entering a village, an extra radio net at battalion level, small things that multiplied. At the Ruhr, the last big pocket on the Western Front, American tanks rolled past lines of German soldiers who had decided to live. The scene was not triumphal. It was weary. The Shermans idled. Their crews ate cold rations. The stoppages and starts of surrender parades played like a broken song. German prisoners occasionally glanced at the tanks with an expression a viewer can recognize across decades. How many of these are there? They counted columns and then realized they couldn't count columns anymore. The road bent, the river turned, and still the hooded eyes of the Shermans appeared over the next rise. Weak is not the word for that. Relentless is. After the shooting stopped, the scoreboard was tempting, and it misled. In single duels, the Panther often killed a Sherman at longer range. The Tiger could command a field by presence alone, but duels are not wars. The Sherman wrote its legacy not with the perfect shot, but with the whole paragraph: production, deployment, doctrine, maintenance, recovery, crew training, infantry cooperation, artillery, air support, fuel supply. It was an expression of a national decision that a good enough tank built in vast numbers and tied to a thinking system would beat a superb tank built in insufficient numbers and starved of a supporting cast. German troops who had mocked American armor early in the war had, by 1945, revised their opinion under duress. Memoirs written later speak of the shock of seeing tank battalions that could be reconstituted in weeks, of hearing the clatter of recovery cranes and the ring of wrenches in orchards that were repair shops by night, of watching a hill fought over today bristle with new American guns tomorrow. A Sherman was a machine whose virtues were prosaic: reliability, standardization, speed of turret, good radios, comfortable crew layout with 5 men sharing tasks in a way that kept them fighting. A gun that fired what was needed most of the time. German tankers who had suffered in winter from sluggish traverses noticed, with something like envy, how American turrets whipped to meet a threat and then locks clunked home. Infantry who had cursed Tommy Cooker myths rethought when wet stowage kept their tanks from becoming pyres. Small improvements mattered. They added up. The costs were real. Sherman crews paid heavily to learn the hedgerow, to bait and beat Panthers, to coax their machines across rivers on pontoon bridges that bucked under treads. They scrawled names on hulls, stubborn jokes against fear, and forged friendships that only danger teaches. They wrote letters home with grease on their thumbs. Many did not return. The point of remembering the Sherman as a system is not to make it bloodless. It is to refuse the disasters of hero worship and of sneer, and to see clearly the politics of steel. A democracy, when it chooses, can aim its factories, railroads, schools, and scribblers of checklists at a single goal. The Sherman is what it looks like when that aim holds. After the war, the M4 refused to leave history's stage. It went to new wars and into museums, into parades and scrapyards. It served in dozens of countries in dozens of configurations, with the British 17-pounder, with French and Israeli upgrades, with diesel engines and new suspensions, with bulldozer blades and rockets. It is still, in some places, a monument with stars fading in the sun. Its enemies, Panther and Tiger, became rarities, preserved like big cats in cages, admired for form, if not for their place in the food chain. The Sherman's shape is common, not because it was ordinary, but because it was right for its time. What did German troops learn, and what should we? That contempt is a poor reconnaissance. That the enemy gets a vote, and sometimes he votes by building 20 of a thing you think you can defeat with one. That a tank is not a knight in armor, but an instrument in an orchestra, and that the measure of an army is whether it can keep the music going when the conductor changes, when half the violinists are gone, when the audience throws chairs. The Sherman is not a romance. It is a statement. We will be ready tomorrow, and the day after that, and we will fix what was wrong, and we will feed what works until you cannot stop it. If you stand today at a hedgerow in Normandy, it's hard to imagine a tank coming through. Walk a field. Run your hand along a cut bank where roots knit. Then imagine a blunt-nosed machine pushing forward, its front scarred by a welded blade, infantry palms brushing steel, smoke drifting. Think of the German soldier on the other side, waiting with a rocket in his hands and his heart beating fast. He knows the stories. The Panther, the Tiger, the weak American tank. He also knows the sound that follows a first volley, now the crackle of radios. The thunder that rolls in from behind, the way that even if he knocks this one out, another comes to take its place. He is not thinking about duels anymore. He is thinking about whether his company will be here this afternoon. He is thinking about how long it takes to drag a gun through mud under fire. He is thinking about numbers. History, told honestly, can be an anchor against comforting myths. The Sherman-ass history is a lesson in humility and in power, not the gaudy power of a single giant, but the stubborn, patient power of millions of small strengths aligned. In World War II, German soldiers learned that the hard way. We can learn it the easier way, by paying attention to the quiet things that decide battles before they are fought. Supply lines, training cycles, maintenance manuals, shared doctrine, the ability to change a plan and tell everyone you've changed it. The Sherman's turret turns quickly, not because it is a miracle, but because someone decided it should, and 100 someone's worked to make the decision real. If you listen in the distance, you may hear the old engine still. Not because tanks are lovely, but because what they taught remains relevant, wherever people believe that brilliance can outrun preparation. The Germans at first thought American tanks were weak. They were wrong in the way that matters most. The Sherman in numbers was not just a quantity. It was a quality of war, an insistence that kept coming, made stronger by the hands that refueled it, repaired it, and refused to let it fight alone. That is the legacy rolling out of the mist. That is the lesson rumbling underfoot. The rest is just smoke.